There's an old saying that states beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but who is the beholder? This matter becomes complicated as we attempt to define beauty through the various lenses of different cultures and societies. In an ideal utopian world, there is an interplay between culture, exposure, and biology that shapes the notion of beauty as a collective process. We found this to be the case in the Is Beauty Cross-Cultural video, where multiple research papers conducted studies between Black African groups and white Caucasian groups found both the African and Caucasians to rate European faces higher than African ones. Part of this, as the studies found, was because both groups were better equipped to evaluate beauty in European faces versus evaluating beauty in African faces due to less media coverage and mainstream exposure, which is why representation is so important. What we didn't cover in that video were how East and South Asian beauty standards differ from the West. For a while now, Asian women have been held to a standard of feminine beauty that suggests that they should be cute and gentle. For example, kawaii in Japan is a frequently used word that considers the cute round-faced look with large puppy eyes. Additionally, aegyo in Korea has been used throughout history to signify a youthful, innocent look. For women, the concept of beauty in Asian culture has often been correlated with success, meaning the more attractive you are, the more likely you will be to marry a wealthy partner and maintain your status quo. Although the idea and its practice is archaic in nature, in Asian culture, attractiveness is still highly regarded in giving one that competitive edge, and is part of the reason why South Korea is the plastic surgery capital of the world. The question then is, do they follow the Western or Eastern beauty standards? There are varying perspectives as to whether Asian ideal beauty standards are an emulation of Western standards or a distinct standard on their own. Nevertheless, there is agreement that the Western media has contributed to propagate ideas and have influenced women on what ideal beauty is, much like it has for any other country in the world. We touched on this in our discussion of ethnocentrism here. Although Westernization has influenced Asian beauty standards, it's unfair to reduce them to merely an emulation of fairness, and not to delve any deeper into such a complex phenomena. The ignorance of Asian beauty trends, that all Asians look the same and there's only one type of Asian look, is just narrow-minded when you consider how big Asia is. I'll try my best to cover everything possible, but consider this an introduction into a larger series on beauty standards. A 2006 study by Dobke et al. Compared the facial preferences of 50 Korean and 50 Japanese women. There were significant differences in ideal beauty standards between both groups, and the test looked at a number of typical Asian features to show that standards differ even by countries relatively close to each other. The author noted that the largest differences between preferences were in the periocular or eye region. Both groups preferred an eye crease, rejecting the typical monolid that's commonly seen in both Asian communities, but Japanese women were adamant with 100% of the group rejecting a monolid versus the Koreans' 78%. Interestingly enough, half of the Korean group preferred the eyebrow peak to be in the middle of the pupil, whereas virtually all of the Japanese, again, preferred it to be laterally further outwards. Yalcin Kaya et al.'s study on eyebrow proportion and other research papers have pointed at the Japanese preference of a more lateral eyebrow peak in between the canthus and iris to be the most attractive in the West as well. As for the nose, both groups preferred a straight and narrow nose and only differed at the nostril. 70% of the Japanese preferred an oval shape versus 72% of the Koreans preferring a teardrop shape. Moving on to the forehead, unsurprisingly, 86%, so again a large majority of Japanese women, preferred the ideal upper third proportion. So if you were to divide your face into thirds, the forehead should be 1/3 of your face, which is very common in the West. But the Koreans had a wider range of preferences from 1/3 to even larger, with both groups preferring a negatively sloped forehead, which I've also covered here. As for the lips, this is where things get interesting. 98% of the Japanese women preferred thin, delicate lips, whereas 78% of the Korean ones preferred full, plumper lips. I'll get to the relevance of all this in a second, bear with me. The majority of Japanese women didn't prefer high cheekbones, but the Korean ones did. And lastly, the large majority of both groups preferred the oval face shape to be the most attractive. Now that was a handful of content, and what I didn't tell you before introducing this paper is that all of the subjects lived in Southern California. Despite being influenced by Western ideals, the Japanese group showed an unrivaled conviction in describing their ideal face. In every test, virtually 100% or close of all of the Japanese participants knew what the ideal face looked like, no ifs or buts about it, whereas the Korean group were more willing to compromise and less decisive. If I were to sum up all of this into an archetype, the Japanese group preferred the porcelain doll look, perfect in its proportions and delicate in its features. The Korean group preferred more neotenous, cute faces, indicated by the fuller lips, defined cheekbones, larger foreheads, and rounder shapes, all of which are youthful, feminine features. The author proposes that Japanese women were more concerned about maintaining a natural appearance, whereas the Korean ones were less concerned, which goes against the myth that all East Asians want to maintain a delicate appearance. This could also help explain why the Japanese group were uniform in their choices, and the Koreans were less so, as the Korean group is more liberal about cosmetic surgery than the other, and so their own ideal faces would change more within their own groups. The Japanese group being so adamant, with virtually 100% agreeing about removing the monolid, could be interpreted as an attempt to become more Western. But that would be a superficial answer that doesn't delve deeper into the question. One of the first cases of modern Asian aesthetic surgery was by Japanese physician M. Mikamo, who performed double eyelid surgery in 1896. The procedure itself had the end goal of producing larger, more feminine eyes, and removing the monolid was just one means to an end. In his seminal article, Mikamo argued that the monolid accounted for 80% of the Japanese population. He viewed it as a defect that impaired vision and made his people look weary and tired that he should correct to modernize Japan. Another example is given by Lee et al.'s study of Japanese depictions of women from the late 1800s. By observing eye characteristics such as interpupillary distance and brow distance, among others, they found a steady change in modern depictions having larger eyes and irises than previous generations. More importantly, they found no significant difference in the presence of eyebrow creases or a decrease in monolids, which supports the case that these beauty standards have been influenced but are not an emulation of the West. I've spoken about universal and cultural beauty standards multiple times on this channel, and this is a perfect example with many different cultures around the world coming to the same conclusions independently on their beauty standards. For instance, both the East and West preferring larger feminine eyes on women. Moving on, let's look at another East Asian study. A large national survey by S. Samizade was conducted to examine the ideal beauty standards in a Chinese population. 1,400 aesthetic practitioners were questioned based on ideal facial features. The oval face shape was the most preferred, which was followed by the heart face shape. Like most cultures, they chose a neutral facial plane as attractive, without excessive jaw projection or recession. In terms of lip shape 2 was the most preferred, which was narrow and had a well-defined Cupid's bow. For the jaw angle, aestheticians preferred the obtuse angle over the angular, well-defined jaw. As for chin shape, the most preferred chin was chin number 2, a narrow and mildly pointed shape with a rounded tip. Lastly, a straight nose was preferred by respondents, which is unsurprising as Asian faces are some of the most neotenized, which means that they have a flat bridge and shallow nasofrontal angle. This last image shows what ideal beauty would look like in a Chinese woman with a combination of all of these discussed features. These results agree with previous aesthetic research papers that female Oriental Asians do not prefer square and defined shapes and appreciate the feminine softness in rounded features. One common surgery in the East is to reduce lower facial width, whereas women in the West prefer to accentuate their jaws to be like Angelina Jolie, which I appreciate that the author actually calls out here as well. In the same vein, East Asians prefer to surgically accentuate the nasal bridge, tip projection, and nasolabial angle, whereas in the West, these are reduced for a more concave shape. If you're going in for surgery or consultation, it's crucial that your esthetician knows about cultural influences in beauty standards as well, because at the end of the day, they'll be the ones suggesting the surgery to you in consultation. A Western bias on an Eastern face might not match. The author gives the example of a non-Asian doctor suggesting jaw width enhancements when the patient herself had gotten jaw width reductions prior. Now, I wouldn't be doing this video justice if I didn't present the other side of the issue. According to the International Society of Aesthetic Plastic Surgeons, in 2017, Japan was ranked the third country with the greatest number of cosmetic surgical procedures. A study by Lindridge and Wang attributes this increase to the notion that Asian women want to fit into the Western world because they believe that Western features are considered the ideal beauty standard. 12 female participants from Shanghai, China, who underwent plastic surgery there, were included in the study. These participants were then interviewed for 45 to 90 minutes and asked questions pertaining to why they decided to do the surgery and whether there was any family or societal influence. Results show that all of the participants answered similarly that Western media influenced their reasoning to seek plastic surgery as they portrayed the idea of what ideal female beauty looked like. While there are obvious limitations to this study, such as selection bias and a low sample size, we can all relate to how someone somewhere in the world might feel the pressure to conform to a globalized beauty standard. With that, we bring this video to a close. There are a lot of different standards to talk about, but today we chose the East Asian ones as it's rarely discussed on the channel. Obviously, Japan, Korea, and China are only a small makeup of Asian beauty, and as a whole in the future we'll work on dissecting them region by region to cover as many groups as possible and highlight underlying biases and issues. If you would like to learn more about your own facial aesthetics and be better prepared in going into surgical consultation, order a report at koovs.com. Otherwise, you can follow our Instagram and read some of the articles we've written on culture and aesthetics over at our site.